As Adolf Hitler mobilized his Nazi army into the vast expanses of the Soviet Union, a great war in Eastern Asia was edging ever closer to join up with the Western conflict. Japan, the land of the rising sun, as part of Adolf Hitler's axis of evil, would let nothing stand in its way as it began the battle to create its own great colonial kingdom. But as the Japanese drove their fleets and armies deep into the ancient lands of China, far beyond the shores of Nippon, a foreign power was about to threaten its very existence. When the American president Franklin D. Roosevelt made moves to halt Japanese expansion, Pearl Harbor became the first casualty of a new chapter in the Second World War. Conflict between the Allies and Nazi Germany escalated into a battle of global proportions, and although Adolf Hitler had without doubt been responsible for the outbreak of World War II, it was now taking on epic proportions beyond his aims of a 1,000-year Reich. The history of the mysterious Japanese civilization and the battles fought by this nation governed by such a proud code of honour will now be uncovered as we travel to the Pacific to discover the truth about the Japanese at war. Centuries ago, China was the giant middle kingdom of the Far East and was a dominant force on the smaller countries and islands of the Pacific. However, as British and French imperialism grew, this ancient civilization began to crumble. Withdrawn deep inside its hermit kingdom, Japan watched the fate of China with great interest. Since the early 17th century, the Japanese had severed all relationships with the outside world, often punishing those who ventured ashore with death. All was well, and for many years they enjoyed peace and prosperity, but in the 19th century, the Golden Age suddenly came to an end. In 1854, the black ships of a great power loomed over the horizon, and a vast fleet headed by an American, Commodore Perry, approached the coast of Japan. The Japanese were forced to end 300 years of seclusion and open their ports to American trade. In 1856, Japan had little choice but to make further concessions to America, as the Treaty of Amity and Commerce gave the United States the right to trade and reside in Japan. Nevertheless, this was far from popular, and many opposed the agreement, while the Japanese nation was plunged into chaos, with rebellions breaking out across its islands. A peaceful settlement was eventually established, with the restoration of the Meiji Empire and the end of the feudal system. The years that followed resulted in a remarkable transformation taking place as Japan strove determinedly to meet the West with equal strength. In the same manner that Japan had absorbed the culture of China over a millennium earlier, it now mimicked the military culture of the West, as the agrarian economy of fishermen and farmers gave way to a society that fast became a great industrial power. The Japanese Navy was modelled on its seemingly invincible British counterpart, its army on the French military and later Prussian warfare. By the end of the 19th century, a modern, professionally trained Western-style army had risen and was ready to take on the rest of the world. But despite emulating the Western style of training, a very different philosophy guided the military principles of the Japanese. A nation once led by samurai warriors had instilled the notion of Bushido, or freedom from fear, in their soldiers. This meant that if a warrior was to serve his master loyally, he should have no fear of death, pain, or defeat, and no regard for himself. Samurai literally means one who serves, and within decades this ethos would be pushed to the extreme as thousands of young Japanese men went proudly to their deaths. This sense of duty extended to all levels of Japanese society, and the people obediently served their emperor when their nation required them to march to war. With such power at its disposal, Japan was keen to ensure the security of its little kingdom, and in the First Sino-Japanese War of 1894 pushed China out of Korea. A decade later, as Russia became a threat, Japan impressed the world once more with its military and naval expertise in the Battle of Port Arthur in 1905. The Russians suffered a humiliating defeat, and the British were so impressed they presented a lock of Admiral Nelson's hair to the Imperial Japanese Navy. However, the battle with Russia was not an entire victory for Japan. When Japanese delegates travelled to Portsmouth in America for a peace conference with Russia overseen by President Theodore Roosevelt, they were far from happy with the outcome, as there was no monetary reparation or territorial gain. Back home, there were riots on the streets of Japan, as people felt they'd been treated as if they'd been defeated, and distrust of the Americans and hostility towards the West began to grow. Despite the frustration of the Japanese, there were some rewards to be reaped from the treaty. They were given control of the South Manchurian branch of the China Far East Railway, as well as a vast tract of territory to the north. The company established to operate the railroad soon became the most profitable cooperation in Japan, building coal mines and harbours, as well as hotels and warehouses, and soon Japanese nationals began to settle in the Chinese territory of Manchuria. When the First World War broke out in 1914, there was another boost to the economy, as Japan was called upon to help Britain and its allies. It sent arms and ammunition to Russia, exported food supplies to France and Britain, and its navy, now the fourth largest in the world, protected thousands of Allied ships from the German forces. But after the war, as the peace treaty was signed in Versailles in 1919, it was clear Japan still deeply mistrusted the West. The Japanese Prince Konoye warned that America and Britain were using idealism as a mask for their own self-interest, and he felt the proposed League of Nations was designed to cement the power of the victorious countries. In Konoye's opinion, there should be equal access to natural resources and international markets, otherwise the resource-poor nation of Japan would have no resort but to destroy the status quo for the sake of self-preservation. Within a decade, an event thousands of miles away would threaten this very existence when the Wall Street crash of 1929 sent the world spiralling into an economic depression. As rural incomes dropped by 2/3 and banks foreclosed on many businesses, right-wing propagandists in Japan seized the opportunity to press for the invasion of Manchuria, which would ensure a supply of raw materials to feed their economy. With a steady influx of Japanese colonizing southern Manchuria, the island nation already had a foothold in the territory. It was also the perfect moment to strike, as China was deeply embroiled in civil war. In 1931, the Japanese made their move, and the leader of the Chinese National Front, Chiang Kai-shek, who was battling against the Chinese warlords of the north, now had to face a Japanese army of invasion. In September that same year, the Japanese accused Chinese dissidents of dynamiting a section of their railroad in Mukden, providing the perfect pretext for invasion. On the 19th of the month, the attack was instigated, with the loss of 500 Chinese lives, but this was only the start. By 1932, the Japanese army had seized the whole of South Manchuria and was moving into Russian-dominated North Manchuria. A dangerous pattern was beginning to emerge, however, as the army had a tendency to strike first and inform Tokyo later. The Emperor Hirohito was deeply disturbed by this lack of control when it came to the military, as well as the government's failure to keep control over foreign policy, and he feared that the West would soon intervene. Nevertheless, within 6 months the Japanese victory was complete. On March the 1st, the last emperor of China, Puyi, who'd been removed by Chinese warlords in 1924, was placed at the head of the new puppet state of Manchuria. The Japanese named it Manchukuo and slowly infiltrated Manchurian culture and life. With the success of the South Manchurian Railway Company, there were already over 200,000 Japanese residents in the country, and the army began to draw up plans for settling 5 million colonists in China within 20 years. Gold mines opened up, the timber industry thrived, and new coal and iron ore finds helped fuel Japanese expansion. Japan also encouraged farmers to grow opium poppies, the sale of which helped fund the imperial army. Before long, there was a dramatic increase in opium smoking, and soon a quarter of Manchurian's population were addicts. Although the West had encouraged opium use in China only decades earlier, the League of Nations was critical of Japan's promotion of the drug. It also refused to recognize Manchukuo as an independent nation and instructed Japan to pull out of Manchuria. In February 1933, a Japanese delegate, Yosuke Matsuoka, responded to the League of Nations in Geneva. He now spoke to the representatives of 42 nations, saying that Manchuria was a matter of life and death for Japan, and on hearing of the proposed international control of the country, he asked, would the American people agree to such control of the Panama Canal Zone? Would the British permit it over Egypt? When he marched out of the building, followed by the Japanese delegation, it marked the withdrawal of Japan from the League of Nations. But as the Japanese military forced its way deeper into Chinese territory, the League did little to stop its movements, being far more concerned over another crisis rather closer to home. In Germany, Adolf Hitler, an aggressive dictator, had seized power and was blatantly ignoring the military restrictions placed on the nation after the First World War. Just as Japan had done 6 months earlier, Adolf Hitler now withdrew Germany from the League of Nations, and the foundations of peace, so carefully put in place with the Treaty of Versailles, were definitely crumbling. Meanwhile, in the east, after 6 years of sporadic battles, by 1937, the war between China and Japan had escalated in size and intensity. Matters came to a head when Japan's request to look for a missing soldier was denied, so the Japanese marched on the small town of Wonping. The soldier soon appeared unharmed, but the incident led to a gathering of reinforcements on both sides at the nearby Lugo-Kyoto Bridge, better known in the West as Marco Polo Bridge. Prince Konoye, now the Prime Minister of Japan, was keen to negotiate with the Chinese, but was well aware his government had little power over the military. Though Japan hoped to eventually establish political control in northern China, Tokyo did not plan the events of Marco Polo Bridge, which rapidly propelled the country into a ferocious war. Japanese soldiers began to pour into China, and beneath the watchful eye of the West, the vast Chinese nation was ravaged mercilessly. Japan's military leader, Hideki Tojo, marched his forces up the valley of the Yangtze River and as far as the walls of China's capital, Nanjing. Foreigners, missionaries and businessmen began to flee as leaflets swept through the city, carried by the icy December wind, warning that if the Chinese soldiers continued to fight for their ancient culture, it would be reduced to ashes. After 4 days of resistance, the Japanese stormed into Nanjing, and 6 weeks of slaughter and devastation followed, and the indescribable atrocities witnessed by the Westerners who'd remained were soon relayed to the rest of the world. By the end of 1938, Japan had within its grasp 9/10 of the Chinese railway system, controlled the entire coastline of China, and the most important river systems. There was little left to conquer, and the terror bombing of Chinese cities had left nothing but destruction and horror in its wake. After more than 5,000 civilians were killed in the terror bombing of Chongqing in May 1939, America imposed its first economic sanctions upon Japan. Stories of the massacre of Nanjing had already reached the West, and there was grave concern regarding Japan's expansionist policies. President Roosevelt had also begun sending aid to China, along with assistance from Britain, France and Russia. But these nations also had escalating problems of their own, as Adolf Hitler's actions meant that war was now inevitable. Consequently, when on September 1st, 1939, the Nazis stormed into Poland, 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The Allied forces failed to stop Hitler's onslaught, and within 9 months, much of northern Europe was under Nazi control. Thousands of miles to the east, Japan was paying close attention to the European battles, and as France fell, it seized the opportunity to invade French Indochina, known today as Vietnam. Arms and fuel were reaching China from the west via Vietnam, so Japan's presence in the country now ensured a blockade on any imported goods. Aid could only reach China now via the British-owned Burma Road, which soon became a symbol of foreign opposition to the Sino-Japanese War. As the Luftwaffe began to bombard the cities of the United Kingdom, Japan once more took full advantage of the unrest in Europe and demanded that Britain close the route through Burma. The British Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, fearful of an attack on the imperial outposts of Singapore and Hong Kong, was unable to spare precious ships for defence, and therefore had no choice but to agree. America was now the only Western power not involved in the war with Germany. What's more, they also had the strength to protect China. And when Prime Minister Konoye made Yasuko Matsuoka, the man who'd angrily left the League of Nations in 1933, foreign minister, the already faltering relationship between Japan and America deteriorated even further. Matsuoka had lived in America from the age of 13 to 22, graduating in law from the University of Oregon, where he was known as Frank Matsuoka. Though considerably westernized, he was obsessed with the idea of an Anglo-American conspiracy aiming to encircle Japan. These fears drew him closer to the belligerent nations of Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy, and within weeks he had bound Japan into an alliance with these two countries. On September the 27th, 1940, Japan's ambassador to Germany signed the Triple Alliance, entering Japan into a 10-year military and economic agreement with the Germans and the Italians. If any power attacked any one of the three signatories, the others would be duty-bound to come to its aid. In the spring of 1941, Matsuoka made a tour of Italy where he waved to the crowds in Rome alongside Mussolini, where his adulation of the Italian dictator, whom he believed was next to God, was alarming to say the least. The Japanese foreign minister also visited Germany and the Soviet Union, but when he met Stalin, he made an unexpected move. His meeting with the Russian dictator went so well that he signed a neutrality pact with the Soviet Union on the 13th of April. It was certainly not what the Japanese government had expected, and officials were left bewildered by their foreign minister's radical new policy. Many, uncomfortable by his westernized manners, were keen to get rid of him. Meanwhile, Prime Minister Konoye had initiated a diplomatic dialogue with the USA. Foreign Minister Matsuoka was furious concessions were being made behind his back, so he sent a provocative statement to the US Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, making it clear that friendly relations between America and Japan were never going to be achievable. Then world affairs took another strange turn when Germany invaded Russia in 1941, despite there being a non-aggression pact between Hitler and Stalin. As a member of the Tripartite Pact, Japanese politicians were shocked that they had not been informed by Germany of what was about to take place. Foreign Minister Matsuoka, however, was quick to side with Hitler, and dismissing his own treaty with Stalin, now urged Japan to go to war with Russia from the east as Germany advanced across its borders from the west. Exasperated by their foreign minister, Prime Minister Konoye and the entire cabinet resigned and were reformed in July 1941 without Matsuoka. Equally, Japan was becoming even more concerned that their supply of raw materials would be cut off by America, and were looking south towards lands rich in resources that were British, Dutch, French and American colonies. Here lay treasures of oil, tin, rubber and many other commodities. Their plan was known as the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, and it was an enterprise that would place the people of Southeast Asia and China under the protection of Japan, who would reign supreme over this resource-rich domain. Keen to escape Western domination, this was a popular strategy, and Tokyo took full advantage of the war in Europe, not only to destroy Western imperialism, but also to strengthen their own position. But even in Japan, opinion was divided. The more cautious navy believed the war with China should be settled first, whereas the army were keen to march south. After hesitating and deliberating, the government finally decided to side with the army, and the public, believing the war to be a just cause, were in full support. By July the 28th, 1941, Japan occupied all of French Indochina and was now in the perfect position to attack the British and American occupied territories of Malaya, Borneo, and the Philippines. Although at this early stage America was unwilling to become involved in foreign wars, it was carefully watching Japan's activities, and President Roosevelt approved the recruitment of airmen into the first American volunteer group to be sent to China. In July 1941, President Roosevelt made an even bolder move, which would seriously curtail Japanese expansionism as he froze all of their assets in the USA, and in the most fundamental terms, this meant that they were now unable to buy American oil. Norway and the Dutch East Indies swiftly followed Roosevelt's lead, leaving Japan only able to source oil from Manchuria, about 1% of the nation's requirements. Consequently, as Churchill and Roosevelt met to draw up the Atlantic Charter, the breakdown of relations between Japan and the West deteriorated further, and the prospect of finding a peaceful solution seemed highly unlikely. Prime Minister Konoye did all he could to negotiate with America and avert war, even proposing a face-to-face summit between himself and President Roosevelt. On September the 6th, the Imperial Conference was held in Tokyo, and it was concluded that if Konoye's negotiations didn't bear fruit by mid-October, Japan would commence hostilities against the United States, the Netherlands, and Great Britain. Even so, the Prime Minister did make one last attempt to avoid going to war, attending a conference in secret with US Ambassador Joseph Grew. He was prepared to travel to meet Roosevelt in Hawaii at a moment's notice, risking his own life. And without doubt, Ambassador Grew was impressed by Konoye's sincerity and urged his superiors to advise Roosevelt to accept his proposal. But Secretary of State Cordell Hull quickly put paid to the initiative, doubting that the rest of the Japanese government would follow their Prime Minister's lead. Undeterred, Konoye still worked towards peace, believing that if the army would agree to a withdrawal from China, a negotiated settlement could be reached. However, the minister responsible for the army, Hideki Tojo, was appalled by the suggestion that all that had been gained in the war with China should be lost. In the end, Konoye realized he had lost the battle, and on October the 16th, 1941, he resigned to be replaced by the war-ready Tojo as Prime Minister, which did not bode well for diplomacy. Just a month later, a Japanese special envoy was sent to America presenting a proposal that the United States cease aid to China and resume trade relations with Japan. But Secretary of State Hull conveyed President Roosevelt's demand that Prime Minister Tojo withdraw his troops from China and sever Axis ties with Germany and Italy if such action was to be contemplated. Even so, while these diplomatic talks continued in America, in Tokyo, plans were being made for the invasion of British and American occupied territories, which were rich in resources. As Japanese troops and ships were prepared for an invasion of the Philippines, Malaya and Borneo, Preparations were also being made for an attack much further afield. On December the 7th, 1941, hundreds of Japanese aircraft approached to the coastline of Hawaii and the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. Just before 8 on an otherwise uneventful Sunday morning, the first wave of bombers attacked, wreaking total havoc and destruction. It was the last thing the American government had expected, and after a second wave struck, 5 of the 8 battleships at Pearl Harbor had been sunk or were in the process of doing so, with the rest sustaining appalling damage, leaving over 2,400 Americans dead. Ironically, only a few hours later, the Japanese envoy still in Washington climbed the steps of the White House to deliver Japan's answer to Roosevelt's demands, totally unaware that an attack had even taken place. The strike had been planned for after the document had been delivered, but the time needed to translate the 5,000-word message had been underestimated. Although Japan had failed to destroy the US Navy's precious carriers and fuel tanks, the damage was nonetheless devastating, and the loss of life deeply shocked the American public.
Since the unprovoked and dastardly attack by Japan on Sunday, December 7, 1941, a state of war has existed between the United States and the Japanese Empire.
The next day, Roosevelt solemnly announced that America was now at war with Japan, and as forces were mobilized and industrial production stepped up dramatically, the European war had virtually overnight become a global conflict. And the Japanese had by now attacked the American territories of Guam and the Philippines as well as Malaya, which was in the possession of the British. All of these lands were rich in raw materials, which would help fuel Japan's seemingly unstoppable empire building. Malaya was the world's primary source of rubber, and cutting off this supply would affect the armies of the West, who were in desperate need of this crucial resource for tyres and other vital equipment. The Dutch East Indies were rich in oil reserves, as well as cinchona bark, the source of precious quinine, so important in the treatment of malaria, while the invasion of the Philippines robbed the US Navy of its supply of abaca, which was used to make ropes for the Marines. After a brief panic, the Navy eventually turned to the strong fibre of the marijuana plant to replace the now unavailable abaca. When the Japanese stormed into the Philippines, the American Army commander, General MacArthur, was taken by complete surprise. He had spent 12 years in the Philippines and had presided over an army made up chiefly of Filipino units who were far from ready for combat. They fought bravely alongside the Americans stationed there, but beaten back by the Japanese, the garrisons were soon retreating into the Bataan Peninsula. Britain was equally unsuccessful in defending Malaya, with the ships that had been sent by Churchill, HMS Prince of Wales and HMS Repulse, torpedoed by the Japanese. Sadly, the sinking of these vessels resulted in the death of 840 sailors. While the Japanese celebrated, back in London, the British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was deeply shaken by the news, especially as there were, at this point in the conflict, no British or American ships in the Indian Ocean or the Pacific. By Christmas Day, British-controlled Borneo had been invaded, Hong Kong had fallen, and Churchill could only look on helplessly from thousands of miles away, as the most important commercial and military centre of the British Empire, Singapore, was left vulnerable. Soon Manila in the Philippines was declared an open city, and within 30 days the siege of Singapore had begun. The Japanese were now moving at great speed, and just a day after their invasion of Sumatra in the Dutch East Indies on February 15, 1942, the largest surrender of British-led military personnel in history took place in Singapore. About 80,000 Indian, Australian and British troops became prisoners of war, joining 50,000 taken by the Japanese in the Malayan campaign. This was not only a military disaster, because as Singapore was lost, thousands of prisoners of war and captured civilians would face barbaric treatment at the hands of the Japanese. As Britain was forced into an unconditional surrender, another member of the Commonwealth was about to suffer its first attack. The vast nation of Australia, situated far away from the conflict zones to date, deep in the southern hemisphere, had been unlikely to feel threatened as Hitler's stormtroopers thundered across Europe. But as the Second World War took hold in the Pacific, Japan was keen to snatch any Allied territory, and with Australian airmen and soldiers fighting so far away, their homeland was left vulnerable to invasion. Residents on Bathurst Island witnessed the first wave of nearly 200 Japanese planes approach Australia on February 19, 1942. The target was Darwin, a valuable port on the north coast of the country, and there was little that could be done to defend such an attack. Ten Allied planes took off to do their best to combat the onslaught, while ships, communication buildings and hospitals were struck by a deluge of bombs. The second wave targeted the RAF base, and by the end of the day, hundreds had been killed or injured, and fearing that the Japanese were about to invade, those who survived fled south. This was the beginning of many Japanese raids on Australia, and the Americans were fast beginning to fear that there would be similar attacks focused along the west coast, and they were actually far from being unwarranted. Less than a week after targeting Darwin, the Japanese bombed an oil refinery in California. Then, on March the 4th, 2 Japanese flying boats attempted another attack on Pearl Harbor, fortunately missing their targets. 6 months later, an even more extraordinary event took place when the Japanese set off on a secret mission to bomb Oregon and destroy the forests of America in a devastating fire. 2 incendiary bombs were dropped over forest terrain on the morning of September the 9th, baffling the US military and the FBI, who couldn't understand how the plane had got so far undetected. Had the weather been drier, the fires could have spread at alarming speed, reaching towns and cities and causing panic. But the plan was not the success Tokyo had hoped for. Later in the war, an even more extraordinary plan was put into action when the Japanese launched over 9,000 balloons carrying explosives and incendiary bombs to drift on the jet stream to the USA. Over 300 incidents were registered across America and Canada, and a monument still stands today where 5 children and a pastor's wife were killed in 1945. Although a tragedy for the families involved, fortunately they were the only victims of Japanese attacks on the American mainland. These unusual strikes were undoubtedly retaliatory as the Americans began to target the Japanese mainland, while the troops fought on in Bataan in the Philippines. In March 1942, as the battle for the Philippines slipped from the Allies' grasp, General MacArthur was ordered to leave for Australia. Within a month, the forces in the Philippines had surrendered to the Japanese after the Battle of Bataan, with 76,000 men taken prisoner. On April the 10th, they began what has gone down in history as the Bataan Death March, as they were forced to walk over 100 kilometres under a blazing hot sun with no food or water. Back in America, emotions ran high, but Roosevelt had already set in motion plans to bomb Tokyo. The USS carrier Hornet had left California on April the 1st, packed with 16 B-25 bombers, and was escorted by 4 cruisers and 8 destroyers. Lieutenant Colonel James H. Doolittle, a former stunt pilot, would lead the attack, which became known as the Doolittle Raid. On April the 18th, the ships were spotted by the Japanese, and the news was quickly flashed to Tokyo. Doolittle and the captain of the Hornet, Mark Mitcher, decided the bombers should be launched immediately, nearly 200 miles further away than planned. The pilots of the B-25s had never taken off from a carrier, but all the bombers launched successfully, and by noon were releasing their bombs over Japan. The cities of Osaka, Kobe, and Nagoya were all targeted. Then 12 planes headed straight for the heart of Tokyo, just as a mock air raid was ending, plunging air traffic control into complete confusion. Bombs and explosives wreaked havoc, and as the smoke rose from the rubble, despite relatively few people having been killed, the Japanese nation was left in a state of shock. Meanwhile, Doolittle, who was suffering a worrying shortage of fuel, managed to land in China along with the majority of his fellow crews. Many Chinese people were killed as the Japanese searched for the American airmen, while back in Tokyo, the nation's government and military officials swore that such an attack would never be allowed to happen again. The Japanese Admiral Yamamoto was keen to focus on attacking the US carriers near Hawaii to complete what had been started at Pearl Harbor, planning to entice the American fleet out to open water by attacking the Midway Atoll to the east of Hawaii. Yamamoto's superior, Fleet Admiral Nagano, accepted the proposal, but as preparations began for the huge assault, there was another offensive to be launched first. Port Moresby lay on the south coast of New Guinea, near the northernmost tip of Australia, and was home to an important Allied base. Thousands of troops were stationed in the area, which was the last Allied bastion on the island, as well as being the last line of defence between Japan and Australia. The Japanese were, needless to say, keen to take control of the territory, which would isolate Australia and New Zealand from the USA, halting the flow of supplies and American soldiers into the region. In May 1942, an armada of 70 Japanese ships approached the port, as America and Britain, fully aware of the terrible consequences if Japan succeeded in its mission, quickly assembled all the forces they could. The Battle of the Coral Sea commenced on May the 4th, and although 2 American carriers were badly damaged during the struggle, by May the 8th, the Japanese had retreated and the port was safe. Prime Minister Tojo's army were keen to mount another attack to seize the port and bombard Australia. Nevertheless, Admiral Yamamoto continued to press for the conquest of Midway. Having completed the invasion of Burma, Japan was now poised at the gates of India, in control of nearly the entire western half of the Pacific. Japan's priority should have been to create a wall of defence to aid transport between its conquered territories and to destroy what was left of the sea power of the Western Allies, especially the American fleet. But time became a major factor, with precious oil supplies running out, and also, if Japan allowed America the breathing space to rebuild the warships and planes destroyed at Pearl Harbor, the Empire of the Rising Sun could well find itself losing every advantage it had gained. The 2 tiny coral islands, which shone like gems in the North Pacific, were the perfect stepping stones towards reaching the ultimate target of Hawaii, where the American fleet was gathered. If the islands could be seized, they'd be ideal for mounting Japanese raids against the coast of America, as well as protecting Japan from attack. Fleet Admiral Nagano also proposed an assault on the Aleutian Islands, a chain of volcanic islands off the coast of Alaska stretching into the North Pacific, which were strategically important for protecting the Japanese territory of the Kuril Islands nearby. Consequently, a separate attack was planned, which would usefully also act as a diversion for the mission bound for Midway. On the eve of these 2 battles, the Japanese gathered a colossal fleet, in fact, the greatest ever known in the Pacific. In preparation for going into battle, ceremonies took place in Japan to celebrate. Cups of sake were drunk, and all forms of the Japanese religions, Shinto and Buddhism, were called upon to bless the men getting ready to protect the empire. On the 28th of May 1942, crowds of Japanese civilians gathered to see the vast fleet off, but the Battle of Midway would not prove to be the great victory that Yamamoto had hoped for. Ironically, right from the outset, the mission was doomed. Japan's naval codes had been cracked, and the Americans, along with their British allies, were all too aware of the plan to launch an offensive against the island of Midway Atoll, which the Japanese had gone to such great lengths to hide. After their long journey across the North Pacific, in the early hours of the morning of June the 4th, 1942, Japanese aircraft prepared to take off and head for Midway. little did they know that every aircraft on the island capable of flight had been put on alert to meet them. Although the Japanese managed to destroy many of the outdated aircraft that countered their attack, by the end of the first battle, over a quarter of Yamamoto's air force was lost. It was then Japan's turn to go on the defensive. In the space of 24 hours, they'd lost all 4 of their largest aircraft carriers, as well as many other vessels sustaining damage, more than 300 aircraft, and the lives of 3,500 Japanese sailors. Significantly, having suffered much greater losses than the Americans, the outcome of the Battle of Midway would be catastrophic for the Japanese, who would never again be able to fight a naval battle from a position of strength. When news of the defeat reached the Emperor in Japan, he was horrified, but nonetheless proclaimed the Battle of Midway a victory. The Japanese propaganda machine did all it could to hide the disastrous defeat from the public. When the fleets returned, the injured were brought ashore after dark and were smuggled into the hospitals. They were kept in complete isolation and unable to communicate with the outside world. Later, those wounded at Midway would describe how the experience was like being kept a prisoner of war by your own people. Meanwhile, off the northern coast of Alaska, the troops invading the Aleutian Islands were more successful. Just a day after the Battle of Midway, the Japanese had landed on Kiska and had captured the sole inhabitants of the island, a small US Navy weather detachment consisting of 10 men and their dog. Still blissfully unaware of the fate of the fleet at Midway, the Japanese went on to capture Attu Island and rounded up 42 inhabitants, the rest of the population having already been evacuated to Alaska. These islands were now the only enemy garrisons Japan had established within the Western Hemisphere, but, shrouded in a constant blanket of mist and snow, the Aleutian Islands would prove a costly outpost for the Japanese Empire to maintain, and so close to home it would only be a matter of time before the Americans retaliated. Throughout the year, the United States had been pouring reinforcements into the Pacific, and by August 1942, after watching the Japanese seize one island after another, the Americans and their allies were ready for their first offensive. The plan was to attack the southern Solomon Islands, which lay to the northwest of Australia and had been invaded by Japan 3 months earlier, from where Allied shipping carrying supplies in the district could be severely disrupted. The Allies made plans for an assault on Guadalcanal, one of the tropical islands, and it would prove to be a long and terrible struggle, resulting in horrendous casualties with many deaths on both sides. By the beginning of 1943, however, the Allies definitely had the upper hand, and the Japanese withdrew as this defeat marked the beginning of their downfall. As more and more Allied troops arrived in the Pacific, the odds against the Japanese increased dramatically, although it would take another 3 long years of battles. They proudly fought and died for their country, believing it to be a question of honour, until the most terrible attack known to mankind forced Japan into an unconditional surrender. On August 6, 1945, 3 months after the end of the war in Europe, the first nuclear bomb ever to be used in warfare was dropped by the Americans on the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and 3 days later, the second was dropped on Nagasaki. Interestingly, despite the Japanese surrender, when it came to informing the citizens of Japan what had happened, matters were nowhere near as clearly defined as they had been for the rest of the world. The emperor told his people that the war had not turned in Japan's favour, being careful not to mention the word defeat, and it would be another decade before the Japanese discovered the true extent of the disaster that had befallen their nation. The country lay in ruins, with over 3 million dead, many more wounded, and in the aftermath of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, a legacy of illness caused by radiation. What's more, thousands of Japanese soldiers fighting far from home, who'd not received formal orders of surrender, continued to fight following General Tojo's command that it was better to die than live in shame as a prisoner. This was their culture, and they knew of no alternative. 29 years after the war, one of the last of these Japanese soldiers emerged from the Philippine jungle, still wearing his tattered uniform and bearing his imperial rifle in 1974. He'd been waiting his final orders. Needless to say, the Japan he returned to was very different from the war-torn country of decades earlier, and today it seems that the relative peace this enigmatic nation enjoyed for so many centuries has once again been restored. The age of the samurai may have long since passed, but the Empire of the Sun that has survived into the 21st century will never forget the horrors of war.